Hello, and welcome to HumbleBrag. My name is Nate Mendel, and in this episode, I'm going to be reviewing remarks made by comic Dave Smith on the Joe Rogan Experience in his recent conversation with Douglas Murray. This conversation drew a lot of attention. It created a lot of waves and made a lot of noise, and I've already heard some commentary, but I don't feel like anyone really touched on the part that matters the most, and that was addressing Dave Smith's core arguments. The YouTube channel Triggernometry just put out a piece, kind of like a monologue, that was very powerful and accurate. The other badass ex-Israeli Mossad dude, the Cohen, I forgot his name, he put out a piece. And even Sam Harris had a conversation afterwards with Douglas Murray about that initial conversation on Sam Harris's podcast. Despite all of that, I still feel like there is important subject matter to be had on this topic. And I specifically want to come at it from the perspective of a Jewish person, a person who lives in Israel. I am a dual citizen of both the United States and Israel, and as someone who lives very close to the Gaza Strip. So I'm intimately familiar with the location, everything that took place, so on and so forth. I think it's very important for people to hear from Jewish people, because while Douglas Murray makes and champions great points, there is still certain opinions and arguments that even he neglects to address. And again, Douglas Murray is a phenomenal friend of Israel, certainly has his morals and ethics straight in that department. But when it comes to conflict, when it comes to this conflict in particular, what matters more than the actual people, right? You could be Dave Smith or anyone thousands of miles away pontificating on right and wrong, what should or shouldn't take place, but to a large degree, your opinion is meaningless. Yes, you influence people, and that's hence this entire conversation. The whole subject matter of this, the whole reason Douglas Murray brought it up, which is very valid, is to shed light on the notion that podcasters have influence on people, and that trickles down to ultimately violence against Jews. Even though I don't know if he was making that point, but I'm just adding that on top of it. But ultimately, podcasters and any type of social media personality has influence over people, and the influence that you have if you're sharing shitty ideas and bad ideas will ultimately lead and push people toward violence against Jews. That's at its crux, that's the issue. But leaving that aside, let's put that completely to the side. Of what value, of what meaning are the opinions of people thousands of miles away, people not invested? In reality, little to none. And I could prove this simply by pointing at Hamas's entire strategy. Since Hamas and Islamic Jihad globally are losing this war because Israel's crushing them from every direction, the only strategy that they have is the influence, the media strategy, the propaganda strategy, and they're doing a much better job at it. Everyone agrees to that. But how much is that helping them in terms of people killed, in terms of losing ground, in terms of reality? Very little bit. How much more so, how much more irrelevant are the opinions of people not involved, of people not even trying to share propaganda, but just sharing their opinions? Slim to none. Dave Smith doesn't need to convince his liberal followers in America that Israel is wrong or Israel is right, so on. Dave Smith needs to convince me. I live in Israel. I can go out and vote. I could enact change in Israel. 8 or 10 million Israelis is who you need to convince. And he's not doing that. But this lends some credence to the fact that on this topic, the people that matter, the opinions that matter, the outlook that matters, are the people living there, the people of Israel. So going back, Douglas Murray has always been a great friend of Israel. He's always seen this conflict clearly. He's been exposed to it. He's been there enough. But even he, not being an Israeli and not living in Israel, will sometimes lack the proper response for certain questions, or not understand, or not choose to deliberately answer those questions. And it's not just him. The reason this topic excites me, and the reason I was moved to record this, even though I haven't recorded in weeks, maybe even months, because I've been so busy, is because Dave Smith, after a year of talking about this conflict and sharing his opinions on it, the pinnacle he has come to is a moralistic argument that he laid out in the Joe Rogan Experience and followed up by repeating it on Piers Morgan. We're going to listen to it. The particular argument that he thinks is the argument that nobody could answer, nobody actually addresses. And that's a little upsetting to me. But the reason it excites me is because it's, in his mind, a moralistic argument. And this channel is all about morality, ethics, and logic. So my greater purpose, besides for critiquing and giving some insight on everything he has to say on this matter, is to get to that argument and to refute it and to demonstrate why it is low IQ and it has zero weight. You see, the way to beat low IQ NPCs like Dave Smith, Abby Stein, I think her name is, Francesca Fiorentini, Mohammed Hijab, and all these wannabe intellectuals, is to debate their actual arguments. What a lot of people are doing, and anyone who's familiar with this topic understands this and sees this, is they're just repeating the same taglines, the same facts. And although they are facts and they are truth, by repeating it a million times, I don't think we're going to convince anyone who's, let's say, a fanboy of Dave Smith or Joe Rogan or all of these people who are planting seeds of doubt in them about Israel. I don't think we're going to change their mind. There's a reason they're siding with the likes of Dave Smith. There's something about Dave Smith's intellect, or lack thereof, that these people are aligning with. It helps you understand the intellect, the level of intellect and coherence of these people who follow him. But we need to get more technical and respond on that particular domain. If Dave Smith, and he's just an example, has an argument, same with Cenk Uygur. One thing I want you guys to understand is that there's kind of like, in my head, because I deal a lot with data, software, database, everything gets organized, in my head at least, in this nice organized fashion with tables, Excel sheets. So when I think about the intellectual spectrum, there are brackets, and there are certain patterns of people who fall into certain brackets. What I've argued, one of the arguments I made, it's not really an argument, it's just an observation, and I'm willing for anyone to challenge it, over this past year, was that you should find me one notable intellectual of the 21st century, heavyweight intellectual, that will openly say that Israel is morally wrong and that the Palestinians and Hamas are morally right. You'll be hard-pressed to find such an individual, and I don't think you will. And I'm not talking about somebody who's an Arab, because that's tribalism, there's bias there. But yeah, look up the top 50 most influential thinkers, the very people who shape our understanding of morality and ethics in the 21st century. Find me one of those that will say that Israel is wrong and that their enemies are right. I haven't seen it yet. So who does essentially come out and say it? And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I want you guys to understand that in the intellectual arena, there's a spectrum. And there's tiers on that spectrum. And you have to understand where people fall on those tiers. There's a whole class of, I don't even consider them wannabe intellectuals. They don't necessarily even try to come across as such. So for example, you have Dave Smith, Cenk Uygur, Abby Martin, I think her name is. Did I say Abby Stein earlier? I think Abby Martin. Francesca Fiorentini. Okay, so those are 4. They're kind of in a group. They don't pretend to be major intellectuals, but they certainly are anti-Israel, and they're no experts on the topic of Israel, but they've inserted themselves in there. Some might even say they're grifters, whatever. You have wannabe intellectuals, straight up wannabe intellectuals like Andrew Tate, Mohammed Hijab, right? These are the types that are going to say they're more scholarly, they're more intellectual. They could put forth a logical argument on a moralistic level, on an ethical level. Now, all of these types, when you observe them, as you might do when you observe anyone, you're listening to me right now, you might observe a pattern of speech, a modality of thought, and if you understand it because you watch me well enough, you might find kinks in my armor. But there are certain individuals, and then before I go there, let me just finish with my analogy. Then you have true intellectuals. Whether I agree with them or not on many topics, they're up there in terms of intellectualism. Intellectualism is an art. I don't want to get into what comprises a true intellectual, but it's an entire way of thinking and approaching ideas and approaching everything in this world. Sam Harris, he's a true intellectual. Jordan Peterson, true intellectual. Douglas Murray, although I don't see him up there like that, along with, Eric Weinstein and even Eric's brother, the other Weinstein, I forgot his name. I don't see Douglas Murray up there with them in terms of just intellectualism, but he's close to it. He's certainly a lot closer than, Dave Smith and the wannabe intellectuals. So if you kind of place intellectuals on this spectrum, where do they truly fit in? I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, but there are patterns of thinking and thought processes. When I listen to Cenk Uygur, Dave Smith, not even on the basis that I disagree with their camp, what they're cheerleading for, just on the basis of their logic or illogic, 2 minutes, 3 minutes into listening to them, I'm already cringing because there's flaws in the way that they're thinking. There's contradictions, there's fallacies. You listen to the heavyweight intellectuals, there are no fallacies in the way they think. It's very consistent, very logical. You could have deep theological and philosophical arguments with them and wiggle and weave for many hours, but there's coherence there. When I listen to Dave Smith, I could right away identify incoherence. So now let's go back to what I was saying. You could observe every individual you listen to on the web, on social media, on podcasts, how they think, their modality of thought, the level of coherence, where they may be contradicting themselves, how they go about correcting themselves, do they ever check themselves, so on, so on, so on, and so forth. You could also observe to understand their behaviors, what triggers them, when their ego kicks in. You can see it so clearly, for example, with Dave Smith in that conversation. He doesn't like the whole argument of authority, which we're going to get to momentarily as we start looking through this video. So you can really learn a lot about a person. In any event, I'm making these distinctions and I'm helping you understand this spectrum and this grouping, essentially, because I want you to understand that it doesn't take away from individual arguments, but there's a reason why certain groups of people in certain camps agree with each other and think a certain way. And once you start understanding that certain people intellectually belong to certain groups, not because they want to, not because of nothing emotional, purely as an outcome of their intellectual current prowess. And by the way, intellectualism could be built. So they could leave a certain camp and level up if they truly desire to. But the place you are intellectually at any given moment is essentially a reflection of your current intellectual prowess. So people like Dave Smith, the fact that he falls into the same intellectual camp in my mind as Cenk Uygur and Abby Martin and those types, Francesca, tells you where they are holding intellectually. That's a long and huge drawn out preface for this conversation and topic in general, but I think my listeners might find that interesting to observe and explore as these things continue to unfold. In this video, I'm not going to listen to Douglas Murray. You could go to the Joe Rogan Experience and listen to this conversation. Okay, anyone who's familiar with this topic, I'm invested in it. Like I said, I'm almost walking distance from Gaza, so it matters to me. My survival depends on me understanding this topic really well and not getting things wrong. If I hold opinions like Dave Smith, I die, my family dies. So I don't have the luxury to misunderstand things, to misread my enemy the way that a lot of these people do. This is life or death for people who live in Israel. Okay, so in this video, I'm not going to listen to Douglas Murray. Anyone who knows him and knows the topic knows what he has to say on the matter. I'm going to skip through this video just listening to Dave Smith and going to give my kind of candid, innate response to the things that he's saying. And I'll try to not be repetitive in the sense of just repeating taglines that everyone already knows and everyone already says. I'm going to try to cover some thoughts that are a little bit more direct to his line of thinking and the ones that are not said as often. All right, so let's have a go at it. The first 45 minutes or so of the podcast, they were going back and forth about the argument of authority. Douglas Murray was trying to point out, let's back up even. Douglas Murray right away jumps in and essentially tries to do an intervention on Joe Rogan by kind of confronting him and saying, how many people that are pro-Israel have you had on compared to the opposite side? And kudos to Douglas Murray for bringing it up so direct, so straight on, because at the end of the day, holding people accountable for their actions does and should make them change their actions in the future, and hopefully it will. Okay? Because Joe Rogan has had a lot more people spewing nonsense conspiracies about Israel than they had the other side. So that's how he starts off right off the bat. So luckily they kind of stayed calm, but that in and of itself could have been a recipe for disaster, but they handled it. And this turned into an argument of authority. Douglas Murray was essentially trying to point out that the people that he's bringing on, including Dave Smith, are not experts on the matter, and they go back and forth on this for 45 or so minutes. How much does authority matter? I'm not going to cover that too much. I will just say quickly that it's not very complicated. There obviously needs to be nuance there. I agree with Sam Harris when he spoke about it with Douglas Murray after this episode. You have to, like with everything intellectual, you have to understand the balance, the nuance. You have to understand when yes and when no. If you go too extreme on any side, that's where the problems begin. The fact is, we do rely on experts for important things. For example, you rely on doctors to heal you, surgeons to do surgeries. The example that some people, love to make with Joe Rogan is that, when you're talking about MMA, you're going to bring on experts, right? You're not going to bring me on to talk about MMA, so on and so forth. So you cannot get away from the fact that the people that we learn important things from are experts in their field. That doesn't mean that you can't have an opinion if you're Joe Schmo, but it does mean that your opinion could very possibly be false, and you should understand as a podcaster who has millions of followers that you are influencing people potentially into nonsense. And that's essentially the nutshell of how we need to understand this whole authority thing. If you don't understand that, which it seemed Dave Smith was really struggling to understand that, it is again, as I said in my introduction, a testament to his intellectual prowess, his incoherence, and essentially low IQ, or where he stands on the intellectual framework. Because I believe that that's not a hard concept to understand. It's extremely logical and simple, so anyone who has some thinking juices should have no issue understanding that and accepting that. I'm going to skip 45 minutes in, find the part where they're done talking about that so we could get into the Israel and Palestine conflict. Let's go.
A little bit of a concern. Like, I would say a couple things here. Number one, I'm not denying, I don't know how the algorithm works or what it's pushing. And it's an interesting thing that we probably should all know more about. But I think there's a danger when you're to just classify everything as, well, the algorithm pushes this and doesn't push this. It's like, it could also be that some ideas are just resonating more and some ideas are more popular than other ideas. And there's probably both of those things are at work in that.
First of all, many influencers do know how the algorithm works. In fact, they use and abuse the algorithm. That's why they're so successful. Possibly Dave Smith does not know how the algorithm works, but it is without a doubt that the algorithm pushes nonsense. High quality stuff, high quality conversations, high quality anything doesn't get as much views as stupidity, nonsense, reels, all kinds of spliced up stuff, so on and so forth. So the algorithm currently in 2025, and it's been so for the past few years, undoubtedly favors sensationalism, hyperbolic stuff. I mean, the titles that are put out there are so annoying. It's one of the reasons I despise social media. This person or that person destroys this person. All these types of taglines and stuff like that. It's so obvious.
Dynamic. Sure. But I also think that something like the reason why, say, talking about Ukrainian corruption is more interesting in a lot of ways than talking about Russian corruption is obviously because, like, well, one of these countries is an enemy and the other one is one that we're sending tens of billions of dollars to. And so, yes, debating on between Zelensky and the weapons companies, I don't know. He says he only got $70 billion of it, but we've spent closer to 170, so whatever. But the point is that, obviously, if there is a country that we are propping up, funding, arming, and they're corrupt, I would say my starting point would always be to be more concerned with that corruption than an enemy country, which it's almost kind of a given.
So listen to Dave Smith's logic here. I know we haven't gotten to the Hamas thing yet, but they started out with a little bit with the Ukraine before they got to the Hamas thing. But this gives you a nice display of how he thinks. He thinks it's logical to go after Ukraine for their corruption while they're at war with an arch enemy, Russia, at the expense of losing more Ukrainian lives. Think about that. First of all, every country, when it comes to politics, so on, is corrupt, as we just learned when we exited the Biden regime. So every country is corrupt. There's corruption everywhere. Money gets stolen and wasted everywhere. But in Dave Smith's mind, it's logical for him to go after Ukraine when they are in their most desperate need of the past 20, 30 years for help. This is the time he thinks makes sense to go after them for their corruption while Putin's trying to kill them. Try to understand. This is what I mean by when I can't listen to 2 minutes of this guy without incoherence. The decisions, I hear his logic. He has an argument, but his decision making sucks. Meaning he's essentially coming to poor conclusions, or so I think. And you'll see this pattern repeat over and over again. Let the Ukrainians die because I'm concerned there's corruption, so they could all die because, that's more important than them winning against actual evil empire. We're going to skip through all the Ukraine stuff and get to the Hamas stuff.
I certainly agree with you that it's a great tragedy, and I do, I think it's when you accuse me of using the quotes that kind of back up what I believe, I think it's very convenient here to remove all responsibility from the Israelis. Like, even if I'm telling you that you have these quotes, I mean, I'm not talking about fringe figures. We could read through the list of people who have admitted what the strategy was with them funding Hamas and propping them up. But hold on, let me just say, so if you're going to tell me Israel props up this terrorist organization in order to kill the peace process, in order to make sure that the international community gives them a no one. By the way, Smotrich, right? The finance minister, okay? He's on record. He's on record saying, look, Hamas is an asset. The Palestinian Authority, they're the liability. Hamas is an asset because we can tell the international community, well, look, what do you want us to do? There's a terrorist organization here. We can't do business with them. And then even Ehud Barak admitted, like, this was also so that liberal Israelis, if it was the Palestinian Authority, they'd be like, hey, we should make a deal with them. But
this is a classic example of the type of nonsense, the cherry-picking certain quotes and lines that I think you only really do and believe. He truly believes what he's saying when you live thousands of miles away. There's a reality on the ground, and I think it's only people who, it's very conspiratory by nature, and people who are into conspiracies and they're into blaming everything on one thing, they tend to exhibit this type of behavior. They know nothing really in depth about the politics and the location, yet they pick certain things that happen over the course of many, many years, certain things that have been said, taking it out of context, certain things that have been said for particular reasons, to make other points, and they essentially use it to weave a nice story for themselves. But I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but it is interesting to observe these types of arguments from conspiracy nut jobs.
Since it's Hamas, they can't. Okay, so if Israel props up this terrorist organization and then as a response to them committing a horrific act of terrorism, decides to level the entire place and just slaughter women and children in large numbers.
It didn't decide to do that, and it didn't do that. But, yeah.
It didn't level the place. Gaza's hasn't been destroyed.
Gaza is pretty leveled by now.
Yeah.
But it did not go in to level the place like that. No.
Okay, they went in and leveled the place, but that wasn't their intention?
No, that wasn't their intention. Their intention was to wipe out Hamas, and when they got in there, they found out that Hamas is essentially embedded in every other building, and there are tunnel entrances essentially in every third building, and there's weapons and grenades and all kinds of stuff almost in every single building. And Hamas is fighting out of every single building. So yes, they went in not thinking they would level the place, and as the war continued and Hamas fought the way they fought, they ended up leveling the place. It's very logical, very simple.
Okay, I think that look, I'm not going to speak for what every person out there believes. I don't exactly agree with like the characterization that there was no outpouring of like feeling after October 7th. And certainly like everybody I know was just like, oh my God, this is like a horrific atrocity. And like an unprecedented terrorist attack from Hamas, the worst terrorist attack in Israeli history against Israelis. And it was horrible. I think what a lot of I'm not arguing that there are no people who are actually pro-Hamas or there are no people who are actually like hate Jews or something like that. I do think that what happens is that a lot of people get put in that category who do not belong there. Much like we've seen this over the last year and a half, where a lot of people, you have John Podhoretz calling Thomas Massie anti-Semitic scum because he said, we're dead broke. We can't afford to fund everybody else's war here. People have been calling Tucker Carlson anti-Semitic all over the place. When these are two guys, Thomas Massie and Tucker Carlson, who have never uttered the words "the Jews" in their life. Like they're just not anti-Semites at all. So there's a lot of people, I think, who are when they're critical of the Israeli government's response to this, get lumped in as pro-Hamas. I will certainly say that's certainly not my position. I think your description of them, death cult, by the way, the same term that Daryl Cooper used to describe Hamas, I think is an accurate one. And it was horrible. But I think that I think that your characterization, first of all, of that they gave the Palestinians a state in 2005 is just wrong. I just think that is not at all an accurate way to describe the disengagement, which we could get into more if you want to. But first of all, I would just point out that if the two-state solution was achieved, I assume you're arguing it was taken away after that. You're not still arguing that the Palestinians have a state, or are you saying they have had a state since 2005?
They were given a state in the Gaza.
And when was it taken away?
Well, they kind of screwed it up for themselves on the 7th of October.
So you're saying from 2005 all the way till October 7th, there was a two-state solution. It had been achieved.
It's a form of two-state solution, not the one that obviously everyone speaks about globally. Of course, the Arabs want more. It's not enough. But it's not that they had a quote-unquote state. They still do. The Gazans could rise up against Hamas. They could end this. Hamas could surrender and return the hostages and end this. And they could have Gaza back potentially. Not Hamas, I'm saying the Gazans, under a new authority. So this is not in the past, this is current.
Oh, okay, but that would be two states then.
No, it was another state. It was different from the PA.
Okay, right, but I'm saying a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
Okay. So what's interesting about that is that this is not how any of the leaders really describe it. I mean, when Netanyahu himself is not claiming that they had already achieved a two-state solution, why are you talking about this? What happened in 2005 in the disengagement was that essentially Israel went from occupying the place to surrounding the place. And they've had it under a brutal blockade since 2007.
The term brutal blockade, it's just so brutal, is the type of term that you learn online and you repeat with confidence, so it sounds good. That is precisely the type of term that you would probably not use if you went to Israel and you visited Gaza multiple times, as Douglas Murray has. Why? Because anyone who's been there, like myself, understands that there is no brutal blockade. There's simply a checkpoint, a border crossing of sorts, just like there is going in and out of any country, of any state, right? Why is there a checkpoint? Because they were attacking Jews. So right away, right in the beginning in 2005, there wasn't one. When they were smuggling arms and drugs and this and that, and they were attacking, they put up a checkpoint and essentially turned it into a regular border crossing, if you will. Brutal blockade. Actions have consequences. But this, again, the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's a display of somebody who hasn't been there, and it lends some credence to Douglas Murray's argument that being there changes perspective a bit. To truly understanding why these checkpoints and these crossings were put up would already automatically make somebody who's intellectually honest not describe it the way that he describes it. So anyone who knows this topic well and understands it can easily identify, based off of just speech pattern alone, when people are talking about Israel, if they truly understand what they're talking about, or if they know what they're talking about, or if they're just repeating taglines. And in this case, it's obvious that he's just repeating taglines.
I don't agree the blockade was brutal by any means.
You don't think the blockade of Gaza was brutal?
I mean, how brutal do you think the Egyptians are?
Pretty brutal. Yeah.
They allowed stuff in.
Okay. I mean, since some stuff has gotten in, yes, that.
Douglas Murray asks, how brutal do you think the Egyptian blockade is? Pretty brutal. My point, exactly my point, that he doesn't even understand. He contradicts his own line of thinking. Call it a blockade, call it, the Wall of China. It's a border, and it's a checkpoint, and you cannot come. It's just like, try to go into Mexico, try to go into Canada, see what happens. It's, it's as simple as that.
That's true.
More than some stuff.
Okay.
More than some stuff.
Okay, I'll say this, right, because there's been different levels of blockade, even before 2007, going back. I know in 1996, they had like a pretty strong blockade that year. According to the World Bank, it contracted 40% of the GDP of Gaza. So just for reference, the Great Depression was a 30% contraction. This was in 1996. For 1 year, they gave them something worse than our Great Depression. That was just 1 year.
I'm going to skip through this whole argument because I find it to be boring and non-essential. It's more just quoting statistics and taglines and stuff like that. The bottom line on goods going in and out is really simple. We are not responsible, as Israelis, morally I'm speaking here, not legally. We are not responsible for feeding another society, especially when that society is focused on killing us. I have no moral obligation to feed a society that spends its day trying to kill me. It's really that simple. They could grow their own farms. They could grow their own stuff. They could make their own food. In fact, we left them in 2005, Gush Katif, when they were dragged out, we left them, whatever the greenhouses and stuff like that, they destroyed it. I don't want to get into the back and forth when we do and don't restrict goods going in and out, but all I'm going to say from a moralistic perspective, and any parent who has a child understands that actions have consequences. It really just comes down, it's as simple as that from a moralistic perspective. So I don't even have these dumb arguments. Behave, become a normal partner of the world, act civilly, and you'll get nice things. Act like a death cult, you don't get nice things. It's as simple as that.
This argument, Douglas, it's just,
No,
again,
I mean
it's,
here.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's not what I'm saying. Look, I'll say this again, because you bring up the point about agency again. And I hear this a lot as a counter. Much like I said in Ukraine, it's not denying anybody agency. I'm not saying that. Believe me, if I was in control of how people acted, I would certainly, Palestinians could have handled things much better, and there are different points where we probably all would agree that we wish they had done it this way and not this way. And I think that embracing, for those Palestinians who embrace terrorism, which from...
I just need to pause midway because you need to understand how he's framing this, he's kind of building up this argument. This line of thinking that he's going to concede that there were some mistakes, but he's going to get to, ultimately, that we still need to behave differently with them. Like, they fucked up, but we need to treat them differently. There are so many versions of this argument, and it's not a new argument. There have always been versions of this argument, why we need to be the adults, why we need to play nice, why we need to be nicer despite everything they're doing. It always takes away responsibility from the people perpetrating the thing. And that's where never again comes in. That's the mindset that you have to understand that Jews must operate under. Never again means no, I don't have to give in and be nice again. They just invaded our country. They slaughtered us. Now you're going to pay for your crimes. It's that simple. But here you have somebody 3,000 miles away giving opinions that we should essentially do better. Don't treat them the way we're treating them. Yes, maybe they made some mistakes. Don't treat them this way. So essentially you're gambling my children. So wait a second, Dave. My children have to pay the price because you want us to be nice again? How about I make a decision if I'll be nice again? How about I'm done being nice? How about October 7th? That was the last day of me being nice. When do I get to decide if I should be nice or not?
The Palestinians fell into a terrible, tragic mistake early on. And
they did not fall into a mistake. Don't call their deliberate actions a mistake. Every single time the Gazans or the Palestinians made a decision to go left versus right, they had a choice, they had time to deliberate, and they decided to do it. So that's not called a mistake. He wants to kind of play it from retrospect. It's a mistake because it didn't work out well for them. That was not a mistake. That was a decision. And after every one of those decisions comes consequences. We are in the middle of the consequences of the decisions that they made just a year ago.
The tragic, tragic mistake in terms of political outcome from the Palestinians is that they really just underestimated the fact that these Jews had no home to go to. This was their home. And you could drive out the French from Algeria because they go, screw it, we're going back home to France. The Jews had been so persecuted in Eastern Europe that there was no home to go. And of course, then after World War II, they were here to stay. And so of course, it's been a tragedy. And of course, a lot of Palestinian actions I wish would be different.
Narratives. They went up against us over and over. They lost over and over. And they continued to do it until today. So that's it.
It should also be mentioned that Hamas did not...
It's, reminds me of people, it's apologetics. He's essentially an apologist for the Palestinians. They would laugh him out the room because he's essentially paying them for being stupid, but everything they do has meaning and reason and strategy. Now, it happens to be that it doesn't work out for them, but he by framing everything in the narratives that he is, he's misunderstanding the depravity and the deliberate nature of their decision making.
Win a majority in one single precinct. They won pluralities all around. So just saying, when we're bringing up this election, half the population of Gaza today is under the age of 18. They were toddlers if they were alive in 2005. Of the other half, that maybe half of them voted in these elections, it was never a majority that supported Hamas. They eked out a victory. And then, of course, there was an attempted coup after that, and that's when Hamas seized complete...
In most scenarios, when people bring up that, 49% of the people or 51% of the people, wanted to vote for a different party, that other party is, maybe a half a notch below Hamas, just so you understand in terms of extremism and terrorism and all that stuff. So it's never, almost ever, a good arguing point on this matter. Here's what we need to understand, and we'll reiterate soon on this. Gazans support Hamas. It is true every week, you see some videos where some of them are going against them, but just as recent as a few months ago, they still had overwhelming and strong support, Hamas that is, from their people. So although Dave is talking about something that happened in the past, try to frame that in the present moment.
Control. The coup failed. Regardless of any of that, I agree with you that, the Palestinians have agency, and I wish some of them had made better decisions. Now, many of them have made better decisions, and it's still resulted in nothing better happening for them and their people. And so I do find it kind of hard to, lecture a group of people who are going through so much, the level of human suffering that's being inflicted on the...
You see how he reflects on his own behavior of feeling bad to lecture a group of people. This goes back to what I was just talking about earlier. He's underestimating, and this is always done. You see this when you deal with cults and people trying to understand people who are part of cults, or trying to save people that are in cults, but the people in the cult don't want to leave the cult. And it's only real insiders who understand the true nuance there. He doesn't understand it. He would be a laughing stock and a joke to the very Palestinians who he's sticking up for. He's no different than the ones who were holding the signs, gays for Palestine or whatever the fuck, the meme was flying around, chickens for KFC. That is how incoherent the entire premise of these outlooks are. Dave Smith and everyone who thinks like him is a joke to the very people that he's sticking up for. The narratives that he creates for them. He's a useful idiot, no doubt. He's part of the reason him, Joe Rogan, and everyone else who spreads this stuff is the very part of the reason why Hamas is, quote-unquote, winning the propaganda war. Israel doesn't focus on that nearly as much because they have other strategies, real boots-on-the-ground strategies. So Dave Smith is very much a useful idiot in that sense. So on Twitter, he'll get a bunch of support from Muhammad's and Hamdillalis because they are essentially happy that he's doing their dirty work. But in reality, and that's why we always have to differentiate between concept and reality. Conceptually, everything he's saying is great. In reality, he's not even a comedian if you stick him into Gaza. He's dead meat. That's what Douglas Murray was trying to point out early on in the conversation. Who were the people right on the border of Gaza? The people who were there every weekend trying to help Gazans. They were getting Gazan children out of Gaza, bringing them to hospitals because they felt like they could help the Gazans. They got slaughtered just as so. People like Dave who think in concept and create beautiful stories for evil will not stand up to the test of time. This is a man-eat-man world. Bad ideas die. Survival of the fittest. Dave's ideas are meaningless because they won't hold up. They will not survive in the real world.
People of Gaza right now cannot be overstated. And so, to lecture them about how you're supposed to handle that exactly. But I will say, man, I think there's kind of this selective empathy that you have here. I agree with you, talk about these teenagers being slaughtered at a music festival on October 7th. It's my God, I have little kids. I can't imagine the nightmare of this happening to somebody's children. But at the same time, we're not having this conversation on October 9th or in November or December of 2023.
No, he's not having that conversation on this show on October 9. But on October 9, people were already having this conversation, so it's no different. If Dave Smith was, on October 9, who he is today, he would already be having those conversations.
We're having it in 2025, where the tragedy that's been inflicted on Gaza is orders of magnitudes greater than October 7th. There are just every day people are inundated with images of just dead.
Rabbi Manis Friedman, very wise rabbi, he said something interesting. We live in such a backwards world. Talk about somebody who understands morality. Some of these rabbis, man, they put these guys to shame. They put the biggest thinkers to shame in terms of morality because they understand it very well. They don't get confused. Politics is entertainment. Political entertainment confuses us. Morality, there are people who specialize in those topics. But anyway, he said like these types of arguments, like people getting upset that we're not crying for the losses of our enemies' children. He's like, how backwards is that? I'll cry for my child, you cry for your child. It doesn't mean I'm not, what was Golda Meir's line? We could forgive you for killing our children, but we can't forgive you for forcing us to kill yours. Anyone who truly understands Israel and what they go through on a daily basis when they enter these wars could truly understand the meaning of that sentence. It's unforgivable. Of course it's a tragedy when an infant in Gaza dies. We're busy reeling over the deaths of our own. Every day another soldier dies. That's, on a population that's tiny, that's huge. So we're busy reeling the deaths and the injuries of our own. We're busy fighting a war, and you're coming after me for not crying for your children. It's not being able to make those differentiations that helps you understand. We are on the intellectual spectrum. Dave Smith's brain is
women and children. This is like one of the most brutal wars, and by several metrics that really, personally matter to me, like the number of dead kids. I think that's a pretty good one. It's more children have died than in any recent war.
It's not one of the most brutal wars whatsoever. The only reason we think it is because of the high-tech world we live in and the fact that there's footage of a lot. Add to that the fact that half the footage that comes out is propaganda and made in Pallywood, it becomes very confusing. But no, Dave, war is always this brutal. In fact, previous wars, World War I, World War II, so on, they were probably even worse. In fact, I would venture to say much worse. But we've never experienced that. We've never seen it with our eyes. I mean, we've seen pictures from, post-World War II. But this argument that what's taking place right now in Gaza is levels of magnitude worse than anything else is nonsense.
I mean, this is like, it does, I do think there's almost like a fundamental framing bias that you get into when people have these debates, and I've had several of them, as you have also. But it seems to me that there's almost an implicit difference in the value that you place on Israeli life versus the value that we place on Palestinians' life.
That's an interesting argument, because what I like to point out when people make that argument is that the Palestinians themselves place that value system. How many prisoners do they demand get released for every single Israeli? And when you answer that, answer me this. Why? Why do we give up 100 for one? 200 for one? Why? Isn't that them affirming to us that they are less valuable? It's such a retarded thought. I would like to think I'm not more valuable than you. But when you force me to give you 100 of your prisoners for one of my hostages, you leave me with no choice but to feel like I am more valuable than you. Is it possible that you live your life, and I'm speaking to the Palestinian here, is it possible that you live your life in a manner that displays and demonstrates that you don't value life? Is it true that I've heard your mothers, your women, your wives say that we have many children so that some of them could be martyred for the cause? Because I'm pretty sure I've watched videos and interviews of women saying that. Is it possible that you come from a culture that doesn't value life and we come from a culture that does? I'm not even affirming Dave Smith's argument. I'm just saying he's asking the question. I'm also asking questions.
And to even like, we've gone this far into the conversation and haven't even talked about the fact that like, dude, Israel has, feel however you feel. If you want to argue, I haven't been there. Stuff does get through the blockade. Okay, fine. This is a captive people, you know, that Israel has dominated since at least 1967. Many of them are there because of the creation of the state of Israel, who used to live.
What does domination mean? What does it mean? Are the Mexicans dominated? Are the Americans dominated? Is Canada dominated? You have a little strip of land, it's your country. Do whatever the fuck you want with it. As long as you're not killing us, we'll help you, we'll give you, so on, so on and so forth. They make a decision to essentially behave like a death cult. So therefore, not just Israel, but also Egypt will put up huge walls. You're not coming in here. We're not going to help you. Start behaving, start acting like a human being. Then Egypt and Israel will help you. This is like such rudimentary actions have consequences, and it's always been like this, that these arguments are just like, oh gosh, put me to sleep. It doesn't stand up to the test of time. In the real world, actions have consequences. In fantastical worlds of feeling and emotion, when life is good and you've never tasted war, when you've never tasted a bomb shelter or ran because the alarm went off, or seeing the rockets in the air, when you've never tasted that, when you don't know reality, this is what you end up sounding like.
Live in what is now called Israel. And they are just, I mean, the amount of human suffering that's being inflicted on them, when, even as you kind of acknowledged with the George W. Bush exporting democracy, Hamas in many ways was forced on these people. In fact, we saw protests against Hamas just recently. So I don't know. I mean, that to me seems to be the greatest human tragedy. And I think much more so than you can characterize it as people being pro-Hamas or people being anti-Semitic. But I actually think that the mass movement around the world.
It's a key word he said there. He thinks that's the greatest human tragedy. The greatest human tragedy in Dave Smith's mind is not the deliberate education and then execution of killing Jews, where your entire society is obsessed with killing an entire nation of people. That's not the biggest tragedy. The biggest tragedy is a democracy retaliating against a people who attack them. And that's his biggest tragedy.
There's a lot there. So number one, like I do agree generally with your point about having some humility in these complex situations. But I would also say, like, do you not then at any point, as you're like a very well-known public figure who's supporting this war, think about the level of human suffering that is being inflicted on these innocent people and go like, man, is there another way? Maybe I'm getting this wrong. Maybe this is the Iraq war all over again, you know, which you also supported, that like maybe that was a big mistake.
The answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because when you truly understand morality and ethics and you have conviction of your behavior, you don't question yourself. I think Dave Smith questions himself a lot. He keeps coming to the wrong conclusions on this matter. But people who understand morality, I was having this conversation October 8th. The first conversation I had was with my brother, and then subsequently with a couple other people on this podcast, was about morality in war. I understood we're going to go kill people now. So are we allowed to? Are we not allowed to? And the only thing that mattered right then and there was the ethics behind it. But once you sort that out, and that was sorted out 24 hours after this took place, this event, October 8th, there's no more confusion. Here we are, more than a year past, and people still have confusion on the matter. Well, not everyone. That's why those who don't have confusion are not confused. They're not worried that we're making the wrong decision. In fact, we're pretty sure we're making the right decision.
Think about it. I've seen it.
Okay,
I
fine.
know
Okay.
it. I describe it in my book.
Okay.
I describe what I see in Gaza with the Palestinians.
Douglas Murray's trying to portray the fact that he lives it. He doesn't doubt. There's no moral quandary. He's not confused. He lives it. He goes there. He sees it and yet he still understands that we're doing what we have to do.
There's two very different goals that are being stated here, right? Like there's the retrieving the hostages, and then there's taking out Hamas. Now, the retrieving the hostages, and actually many of the families of hostages who are taken have been some of the only people really protesting this war in Israel, because of course, if you imagine, if you have your family over there and your government is leveling this place, that is not the best path to pursue to make sure you get all the hostages out alive. I would say that.
By the way, on that particular thing, I recorded an episode, I think it's 2 or 3 episodes ago, with Dara Saker, specifically talking about the dual objective and what is objective one. Is it to save the hostages, or is it to wipe out Hamas? They do kind of oppose each other in terms of objective number one, and I discussed that whole topic. It's actually interesting to understand
that it fell apart. But Donald Trump having his envoy Witkoff go over there and work out this ceasefire deal that they had for a few weeks. They did get, I believe, 30 hostages back during the phase 1 of this ceasefire. Seems to me like that would be the method to pursue to try to get the hostages back. But if you're talking about eliminating Hamas, and I think there's something kind of interesting that you touched on there. I don't I disagree with much of your characterization of it, that like Israel are the good guys who always follow the rules. We could kind of get into some of that. There's lots of rules that Israel does not follow. That being said, yes, of course. I mean, you're describing guerrilla warfare, terrorist organizations. That's right. It stated differently, Gaza doesn't have an air force or an army or a navy. They're just basically
this dumb behavior, the apologetic behavior. I see it a lot with Cenk Uygur as well. It's all, everybody does it slightly different, but it's all the same thing. And when you start recognizing the pattern, it's like making light of. What are you making light of it? Hamas chose to fight this way. Hamas are actively choosing to fight this way. So we are actively responding in accordance with their decisions. The apologetics are so detached from reality. Israel and the IDF doesn't have the luxury to sit on a podcast behind a mic and pontificate ideas. If it is, it's boots on the ground. It's reality. There are actively people in there. They're on the ground fighting. They do this, we do that. All we could do is react to their behavior. So stop making light of their behavior. Hold them accountable to their behavior.
Militias running around.
By the way, if these big podcasters had any sense of morality and the entire world didn't go against Israel throughout this past year plus, and everybody would appropriately put a ton of pressure on Hamas to release the hostages and surrender, there's a strong possibility that they would have done so already. But instead, people like Dave Smith and his buddies are putting all their energy into essentially slandering Israel, which is inevitably leading to the conflict dragging out more and more. The beautiful butterfly effect.
I don't think, morally speaking, when you're inflicting this level of suffering on a group of people, that the calculation should be like, well, we want to remove Hamas from power. That's the goal. Justice for October.
Dave Smith doesn't think that that's what the calculation should be. So remember, a podcaster 3,000 miles away, pontificating and gambling with my children's life. How realistic is this, right? This is what I keep on saying. I don't know if the point comes across. Non-essential, meaningless social media personalities and media personalities having opinions on matters that affect the well-being and survival of me and my family are completely meaningless. And that's essentially the reason I share it this way is because I'm trying to give over and portray slightly the Israeli mentality, the realistic mentality. The Israelis I know are not sitting on social media listening to this crap. We're living it. We're living survival. We're doing what we need to survive. And because we are doing that, we understand the discrepancy between your fantastical world and your world of theory and our survival.
7th. There's lots of governments around the world that we would, and Hamas isn't exactly a government, but there's lots of regimes around the world that we would all like to see removed, but but that doesn't mean that we would approve of any means by which to get there.
And here's where he's wrong. We have a moral obligation to wipe out evil, evil that clearly states that they're trying to kill us. The Bible tells us, and what the Bible tells us is morality. The Bible tells us when somebody rises to kill you, you need to rise up first and go kill them. That is moral. The notion of any means necessary, absolutely. That just comes down to military capability. But yes, we have a moral duty or a moral obligation to wipe out Hamas by any means necessary.
I think Kim Jong-un's government should be dissolved. I'm sure we would all agree with that. But if you were like, I'm going to level the place and just like slaughter people in order to do it, you might be like, okay, hold on. But aside from that, this has been acknowledged at the highest levels of Israeli intelligence and U.S. intelligence. That there's just no way to get rid of Hamas without it being replaced by more Hamas or Hamas-like group, because it's the basic understanding of this whole situation, right?
There is some truth to that, even though the counter-argument is that we pretty effectively wiped out the Nazi and the Third Reich. The Nazi outlook and the Third Reich, even though it slightly exists, but it's pretty much gone. But a deeper point, there are two deeper points that we need to understand, is that A, in order to continue to survive, you have to do what you have to do, right? Meaning we have to wipe out the enemy that's trying to kill us, regardless of long-term outcome. That's number one. And number two is that I do believe that all the democracies of the world have a moral obligation to essentially wipe out jihadism globally. So it is true that you can't wipe out Hamas. I think the time has come. The world has seen enough extremism. We've matured from it. At least half the world has. Let us collectively fight and wipe out all jihadism globally. So not just Hamas, and it shouldn't just be Israel's endeavor. Israel seems to be the punching bag, the middleman. So we get attacked first, we fight back first, we preemptively attack first. We're trying to keep essentially the world safe from terrorism. But if Israel wasn't in the way, all of that energy would be directed toward other Western civilizations. So yeah, we can't effectively wipe out the notion of Hamas, in other words, jihadism. That is a global effort that many countries must take on, and I believe will eventually take on. It's just a matter of how many more people will unfortunately have to die, innocent people, before we do so. Because that's the teva, the nature of man, the nature of the world, it seems, is such that we don't really learn until blood is spilled. So 9/11 wasn't enough, October 7 wasn't enough. Unfortunately, as you could see, you still have half the world supports, essentially, the very people who supported and perpetrated it. So unfortunately, b'derech teva, by way of nature and our behavior of humans not learning from our mistakes, many, many, many innocent people are going to die from jihadism, from terrorism, and eventually it will move various countries to take serious action, not just Israel. That's just my prediction, because just by watching the patterns of the world.
General McChrystal's insurgent math. There's still Hamas people. Hamas are popping back up in the areas that Israel's already leveled. And the more innocent people you kill, the more radicalized you're going to get this population, the more these people are going to hate you and join up with the resistance movement. And so I just think that to use the justification that we're trying to get rid of Hamas, and therefore it's not like, it doesn't matter how many innocent women and children die in the process.
Of course it matters.
Or there's no responsibility on you. You now are not responsible for the bombs that you drop, how many people they kill.
Israel takes accountability and responsibility for the action that it takes, and for the most part, with rare exception, they don't really step out of the Geneva Convention. They follow the rules of war, the rules that have been set forth and agreed upon by most nations. So it's a non-argument.
It's easy to talk about how, like, if the Palestinians had done this different, then maybe things would have worked out different. But I just think, again, when you look at things, when you say...
Since he brought it up again, I want to repeat, we should not look at this statement, the way that he frames it, the way that he narrates it, as something of the past. If the Palestinians could do something different today, and it's our responsibility to push them to do something different today. That's the whole concept here. This is what people apologists who frame things this way, irks me. Stop pretending like this is a thing of the past. This is active. After October 7th, they went on TV and said they would do it over and over and over again. Today, actively, a lot of the Gazans still support Hamas. So there's no differentiation between them and Hamas. Their kids are literally Hamas members, so on and so forth. So there's no then, there's now. They're still doing it today, and unless we motivate them or push them or make them change their mind, this doesn't stop.
Which essentially I think is your point here, right? Which, I mean, I tried to push you on this, but you're saying, look, we can degrade Hamas, but the cost of that is going to be slaughtering a whole bunch of people.
Not slaughtering, it's war.
Dave Smith here, which I will admit I kind of like that he's pushing Murray against the wall to get a direct answer on the following question. Are you saying that we're going to get Hamas, but the cost will be XYZ death? Murray doesn't want to answer that. Journalists, political commentators, and these types generally don't like to say things that could get them in trouble. I will answer for him because it is a good question, and the answer is yes. If we know right now, prophecy, that the only way to wipe out Hamas is to kill our way through another 10,000 children, we still have a moral obligation to do so. It's really that simple. There's no other way to put it. Now, we have to mention the reason we're not evil by doing that is because we don't want to do it. They are essentially forcing it, so they're the ones doing it. Who takes the brunt, the responsibility, ultimately? The entity that is forcing that to take place. And it always was Hamas, and it will continue to always be Hamas. So we don't want it to go that way, but if you leave us no choice, it has to go that way. That's unfortunately how, by any means necessary, works. If we had to, and there's arguments to be made, yes or no, if we had to, though, drop an atom bomb to end World War II or to stop other millions from dying, then you have to do it. And it's something that newer, softer generations don't seem to understand. And it's rooted in the notion of not understanding morality in general. And as we're going to get closer toward the end now, where Dave is going to inevitably make his pinnacle argument on morality, we're going to explore and see why he's missing the true fabric and understanding of morality. He has a very basic and infantile comprehension of it. And this is, I think, what's rooted in a lot of his misunderstanding, a lot of his miscalculation.
I think you're okay. They're not being slaughtered. They're being killed. Okay, whatever
They're
word
being
you want to use.
killed in a brutal war started by Hamas. Yes.
Yes, it's babies and little kids.
There is a difference between the term slaughtered and being killed. I use the word slaughtered pretty loosely, but yes, they're slaughtering kids, but they are getting killed in the line of fire as we try to target Hamas and operatives and locations, so on and so forth.
Screaming out for help under rubble, and no help is coming. They sit there under the rubble until they die. That is the level of human suffering that's being inflicted. And if you want to say, well, listen, that's a price that I'm willing to pay to try to degrade Hamas, even though you yourself recognize that we can't totally eliminate them, but we could maybe degrade them or maybe take them down a peg. No. And the price for that is these babies being tortured to death, essentially, whatever you want to call it. Okay, but from the other side of that story, like if there's, like, I got little kids, I don't know if you have kids, I know you have kids, Joe. If anybody ever was saying to me that, like, my kids were the acceptable price for this policy that we want to put into place, I'm saying I don't think there's...
If you are the parent of those kids and you're teaching those kids to hate and kill Israelis and you support Hamas, then unfortunately the price to pay is exactly that. See, the Palestinians understand this. That's why he's a laughingstock, conceptually. Because he doesn't understand it. The very people he's defending, they understand it. They say outwardly with their mouth, we sacrifice our children for the cause. But he doesn't understand it. He's trying to apologize on their behalf, and they themselves would laugh at this.
Any scenario, any scenario, Douglas, where there would be any time where you would accept Israeli kids dying like that as an acceptable price for a policy that you're going to be advocating for?
Why are we responsible for the way that they treat their children? Again, holding Israel to some standard that's just far, far, far beyond logic.
Back to the what is actually.
Listen, let me just, how about I say it like this, okay? And by the way, when I say it like this, I'm not claiming that disputes between nations are the same as handling dispute domestically. I'm just saying on the idea of intentionality or
here it comes.
Who wants to do this or whatever. Look, even if you had the right, let's say somebody broke onto your property and killed some of your family members and you want to go kill this guy. If he goes back to his apartment building and you know that there's women and children in that apartment building, and so your move is to blow up the building, what you would be charged with is murder in the first degree. Cold-blooded, premeditated, intentional murder. And you could sit there and tell the judge, I didn't want to kill all those people. Why would I want to kill all of those people? I just had to kill that one guy. But that's bullshit. That's not what counts. You did it intentionally. You dropped a bomb knowing that there were women and children in that building. You're taking an action knowing that these innocent people are going to die. Then that is by definition intentional. And, you could sit here and talk about, and it is true, there have been documented cases of Hamas placing missiles in mosques and in schools and things like that. But when you look at the aerial footage,
I like how he says it, like documented cases, as if it's like here and there. No, it's every other building. Yeah.
Of Gaza, that does not describe every single strike that Israel is committed.
It absolutely does. Building by building, guerrilla warfare, building by building, compound by compound, until it all looks that way. It didn't look that way overnight. It took a year to look that way, and there's a reason for that.
Israel has launched. There have been tons of bombs dropped where it's simply, and we have very good reporting on this, where they've literally just have information that they believe with some degree of certainty that a couple of Hamas militants are in this building, and so they blow up the building.
This is a display of Dave's complete lack of understanding of how precise military is and military intelligence is. With rare exceptions, with some mistakes, they're actually very accurate, and they know exactly who they're targeting, where they are, so on and so forth. So he's just completely wrong. It's nonsense. Listening to Dave Smith on Israel or on war or on military or on certain things other than comedy is like listening to a toddler give you a speech about mechanics.
That is intentionally murdering innocent people. And if you're going to advocate for this war, I don't see how you can do it without saying that, like, at least
it's not intentionally. In the way that he's framing it, it is intentional, but there's, from a legal perspective in terms of war, it's completely sound, because it is understood that if a military body is going to use and abuse civilians in that manner or civilian structures in that manner, it cannot stop the war essentially from taking place or being carried out. That's why legally, from a military perspective, it is allowed to be done. So in other words, if Hamas hides in a hospital, which they do, that hospital then becomes a military target, a legitimate military target. So again, it always comes back, the onus always comes back to Hamas. But when you don't understand morality, you don't understand right from wrong, good from evil, everything gets misconstrued and confusing.
Bite the bullet that Madeleine Albright did when she was asked, we've played this clip on the show before, when she's point blank asked about the sanctions on Iraq and our 500,000 children, is that price acceptable? And she said, yes, we believe that price is acceptable. You're saying if you're going to support this war, you know this is the price of it, so why can't you just say, yes, that price is acceptable? Because then we could have a real conversation about why the other side is going to look at you like a monster.
I, by the way, wish that people were more direct and open in terms of how they communicate what is and is not acceptable. We need the world to speak more on ethics and morality, because everything ultimately comes down to it. Again, one of the reasons I got excited about this conversation was because after more than a year of this back and forth between all these different personalities, I'm like, finally somebody's talking about the crux of the matter, or at least he's trying to. Now, again, he's coming to the wrong conclusions, but it was quite fascinating to me, because this has basically been all I've been talking about whenever I talk about this war, is the morality and the ethics behind it, because all other decisions and understandings and convictions and sleeping at night, everything relies on it. So you have to know where you are morally.
Well, I don't think it's correct. I mean, you always kind of like ascribe the best of motives to Israel and the West and nothing but the worst of motives to all of their enemies. So
Yes. And if you follow the pattern, his line of thinking, you will realize that it's all rooted in the same thing. Not understanding morality, not understanding right from wrong, good from evil. When you don't understand good from evil, when you don't have good moral foreground, essentially, all the conclusions that you come to thereafter are bad conclusions. And Dave Smith is a perfect example of that, a stunning example, unfortunately. For the final argument, we are going to go to Piers Morgan because Dave Smith, articulates it on Piers Morgan. This Piers Morgan trio, I don't know what to call it, showdown, took place after the conversation on Joe Rogan. But this is his pinnacle. This is what he's come to after a year and a half, and I want to address it because it doesn't seem like anyone really addressed it head on.
So to the analogy that I'm making, and you know, as you were quoting me on Twitter the other day, I'm not saying that I'm not familiar, although I'm not claiming to have your level of expertise with international humanitarian law, or you can assert that war works a different way. I'm talking about something much more fundamental. What I'm saying is that Douglas is making the claim, and many others are, that Israel's killing of civilians is unintentional. And I'm talking about a very basic philosophical concept of morality, of intentionality, and that by what people mean when they say intentional, that if this was done domestically, we would consider it intentional. The point is that war, yes, look, there's been the Geneva Convention, there's international humanitarian law. It goes back to the mid-19th century, was codified into law after World War II. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a step in the right direction. But this is all a politician or a group of politicians declaring a word, and the fact that there are lines drawn on a map does not in any way magically transform morality or the basic philosophical concept of intent. And even in your example there, if I were to give out pamphlets, give out a warning, tell everybody I'd really like you to leave, and then they didn't, and I blew up a building, we would consider that intentional murder. Now, my point, I think a lot of times people object to almost what the implications of this way of looking at the world might be, but forget all of that for a second. I'm just talking about how human beings think about these things. And when you talk about an intentional killing, now, by the way, I should also...
I love that he's about to go from trying to formulate a moralistic argument to displaying that ultimately it really comes down to his emotions.
Stipulate that it's not as if that's the case in every single one of these strikes that Israel's taken, and we've gotten all types of evidence about this, and there's quite a number of cases, hundreds of cases, where they're waiting for terrorists to go back into a residential building and then attacking the building, suspected terrorists, I should say. But regardless, none of this is even really the point. The point is that on a very basic human level, and I would also think this is completely incompatible with Christianity, although I'm not trying to lecture anybody about that, but there is no micro and macro morality. There is no micro and macro intentionality. These are human concepts. And if you are dropping a bomb and you know that there are women and children on the receiving end of that bomb, then that was done intentionally. And I think this is the reality of war. And I think if we're going to have a conversation about this, we should deal with it in reality.
All right. So that's his argument. There is no micro and macro morality. To me, just as an observer, it sounds like he's just recently coming together or formulating this moralistic argument. He feels like it's strong. He started it on Joe Rogan and he's strengthened it here. And nobody really addresses it head on, but I think it stems from him not understanding morality whatsoever. And in fact, anyone who understands the ABCs of morality could easily see through this. So let's break down a couple aspects of it. So first of all, ask yourself, why does he think his analogy of mixing in the domestic case, whereby a bad guy goes into a home, you know that there's an innocent person in the home, you blow up the home, you therefore intentionally killed. Why does he, even in his argument and for the sake of his argument, why does he think that that's immoral, right? What's his basis for morality, in other words? We have to ask ourselves, where do we get our morality? Jewish people, for the most part, get their morality from the Bible, the Old Testament, the Torah. The Torah tells us how to conduct war. There aren't a lot of rules and a lot of statements about it, but there are some. For example, the Bible tells us that war should be decisive. It tells us that you must allow your enemy to leave and flee prior to conducting war, waging war, which, by the way, Israel is great at doing. They did so before they went in after October 7th, and they continue to do so by warning people to get out. So those are just some examples, but you have to ask yourself, where do you get your morality from? Where does this stem from? I don't know where Dave Smith gets his morality from. Maybe it's just concocted from his upbringing, maybe some New Age stuff. I don't know. I have no idea. But you can see that he's confused and he's trying to piece together a strong moralistic argument, but it doesn't hold up. So the first question is, he's bringing an analogy and an example from a domestic case, but what's his basis for that? If you're going to say that that's right and this is wrong, why is that right and this is wrong? What's the basis for it? How about if in 10 different countries the law is different in those same cases? Let's say you have that same case, that same scenario play out in 10 different countries, and the law would be prosecuted differently across 10 countries. Which one is right? So that's why I'm confused about where his morality is. Why is he basing it off of United States law, domestic law? Because the laws of war are different. Now, as to his core argument, his moralistic argument here about morality not changing and it not being relative, he's absolutely and unequivocally wrong. What is right and what is wrong in each scenario does change. It changes by the scenario. And I'll give you some examples, but once you understand these examples, you could apply it to anything, and you'll see that the entire weight of his argument makes no sense. It's not a real moralistic argument. It's a moralistic argument from somebody who doesn't understand morality, unfortunately. And to think that this is the culmination of all of his debates over the past year and a half on this topic, wiggling and weaving and getting on these biggest talk show hosts and just pushing agendas, so on and so forth, this is what it all comes down to. I'm not surprised, because what it essentially means to me is that it's his emotions, and he's trying to rationalize and intellectualize his emotions with all this other stuff. But he's not a super heavyweight intellectual. So his ideas of morality are completely meaningless, or they should be to people who care about morality and ethics. You want to know morality and ethics, listen to people who literally helped shape it in the 21st century. They're on the side of Israel. So let's look at some scenarios where morality is relative to the scenario. Number one, let's look at a parent-child relationship. Is it acceptable? Is it moral? And is it ethical to walk up to a child who's nicely playing in the playground and smack him in their face? Obviously, the answer is no. That would be immoral. Now, is it acceptable to smack a child when they just lit a cat on fire and killed it? Well, it depends who you ask. In the more New Age philosophies, no hitting is promoted. But the traditional answer and the common consensus would be yes, there are times when it's appropriate to smack a child. And it wouldn't be immoral if you smacked a child. Some people will smack a child or spank a child when they do something dangerous, like play with an outlet or walk into the street, so on and so forth, so they can learn through fear. Fear is one of the mechanisms of learning. Although I understand that it's going out of date, but that's not the point. I'm just trying to give you some examples so you can start understanding how morality and ethics are relative to scenarios. So, but what's the difference? In both cases, you're just walking up and smacking a child. Why is one okay and one is not? Because it's relative to the scenario. Let's look at another one. Is it moral, as you're driving down the road and you see a deer out there, to pull over and shoot him in the face and drive away? Obviously not. Killing another animal if you're not doing so to reap his meat or to consume the flesh to survive, is 100% immoral. But what's if you're driving down the road and you see a deer on the floor, on the ground, and it had just been hit by a car and it's suffering? Is it moral to pull your gun out and shoot it in the face to take it out of its misery? The answer is yes. Why is it, in one case, where you're doing the exact same thing, taking a gun off of your hip and pulling a trigger and ending life, why is one scenario acceptable and one unacceptable? These are just two examples, but they give you a little bit of insight into how actual morality and ethics are thought about intellectually. So Dave's entire premise is that it doesn't change. If something is wrong in this scenario, it must be wrong in this scenario, or it must be a blanket statement. Now, I would venture to say that the examples that he gave themselves don't even make sense. But let's leave that aside. The argument is a non-argument. It's not a true moralistic argument. It makes absolutely no sense, and it's a display of his lack of understanding of morality. That pretty much sums up my thoughts and feelings when watching and digesting all of this nonsense. Like I said, I was happy and a bit excited to see people talking about morality. The word came up, intentionality, a little bit of ethics, some morality. Finally, it's disappointing that Dave Smith is the one pushing that agenda, because I think that Israel having the moral high ground in this war, those who support Israel should be pushing the moralistic message more. And over the past year, I've seen some Shmuley Boteach, maybe Dennis Prager. It comes up. Even Eric Weinstein, I think even it was on this particular episode on Piers Morgan, has his roundabout ways. He loves coming at things from various angles. Obviously, Sam Harris has been pretty consistent with regards to this topic, but you're not hearing it enough. What are we hearing constantly and incessantly? Politics, political entertainment, conspiracy, he said, she said, feelings, all day long, feelings. The reason we feel okay with our actions and we can sleep at night, despite what's going on in Gaza, is because we understand our morality. We understand our decision making, and we understand and we know and we're convicted that we're doing the right thing. Unfortunately, it seems like Dave Smith isn't calm, isn't convicted. And he shouldn't be, because he should keep searching until he figures it out. You know what I'm saying? I wouldn't want somebody like Dave Smith to be calm about his feelings, because it's that angst, that anxiety that should keep him moving and searching until he realizes, whether it's now or in 5 years from now, that there was something that he misunderstood on this topic and that he was truly ignorant. And I believe truth does prevail. I think everyone in their own journey, so somebody like Dave Smith or others who think like him, might reflect back in their older years, in a long time from now, and see things differently. Or maybe they won't, but whatever the case is, those who have morality by their side, those who know they're acting with restraint, and they're doing everything they can to do things right, which is essentially what Israel does and the Israeli population tries to do on a daily basis, we could sit here calmly with conviction, knowing and feeling that we are behaving morally. And that's why weak arguments like those from Dave Smith and all his compadres doesn't move anything. It doesn't change anything. It has no effect other than making other people who don't understand morality hate Jews. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. I've been exceptionally busy, but these are the types of conversations that I like talking about and covering. So when I have a moment, and with your support, I will hopefully continue to do so. Thank you. Peace and love.
Leave a like and subscribe.